The moon was high in the sky, casting an ethereal glow upon the sleeping village. Inside a small cottage, a young woman stirred. She wasn't dreaming, not in the conventional sense. They didn't sleep like we do today. Their nocturnal routine was much more complex, more intimate, and arguably more intriguing. Welcome back. Let's delve deeper into this captivating custom of the medieval period. Her eyes were open, gazing intently at the rough-hewn ceiling beams above her. By the time the clock struck the witching hour, the revelry would have subsided. The tavern would be mostly empty, its tables cleared of tankards and gossip. Stretching, she would rise from her bed, feeling refreshed and renewed, ready to greet the day with renewed vigor. In a world without alarm clocks and electronic screens, they relied on the darkness and dimness to guide their nocturnal routine. Even today, there are communities around the world that maintain this traditional sleep pattern, demonstrating that it's a practice deeply ingrained in human nature. It colored the way people interacted, worked, and slept, creating a rhythm that was both different from and strangely familiar to our own. It's a journey back to a time when the night wasn't just a prelude to the next day, but a world unto itself, rich with activity, introspection, and a deep connection to the natural world. It reminds us that our modern lifestyle, with its emphasis on nonstop productivity, is just one way of living. It encourages us to question the norms of our own time and consider the wisdom of practices that have endured for centuries. It's only with the advent of modern technology, with artificial lighting and 24/7 connectivity, that we've shifted to a world of continuous daytime alertness and late-night scrolling. Our bodies, perhaps, still yearn for the simpler rhythm of the past. From the peculiar habits of the nobility to the everyday life of common folk, we'll explore the fascinating traditions that shaped medieval culture. Don't forget to hit the like button if you're eager to unravel more secrets of the past. Your support means the world to us. And if you haven't already, please subscribe so you never miss an enthralling episode. Share your thoughts, ask questions, and connect with fellow history enthusiasts in the comments section below. Thank you for watching. Their bodies knew when to sleep, just as surely as the tides know when to ebb and flow. These periods of wakefulness were not viewed as interruptions, but as natural pauses in the day. They provided a welcome break from the demands of daylight hours, a chance to rest the mind and body before diving back into the activities of the day. Her night had followed the ebb and flow of the natural world. She had slept when the darkness deepened, and she had risen when the first hints of dawn appeared. It was a natural cycle, one that mirrored the rotation of the earth and the passage of time. Outside, the wind might whisper through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of an owl or the rustling of unseen creatures. It was a time when the veil between the worlds seemed thinnest, and the darkness held a certain magic. It was also a time for introspection. Back in the cottage, the woman has risen for her first waking. Now, lying fully awake, she might spend this time in quiet contemplation, reflecting on the day gone by, her mind wandering through memories and plans for the morrow. Some might engage in light chores, mending clothes, or making tools, but these tasks were not hurried. There was no urgency in the quiet hours before the dawn. The work was done in a meditative state, almost as a form of relaxation. But she wasn't awake either. She was experiencing a state of consciousness that defied easy categorization, a twilight world between wakefulness and sleep. The woman sensed the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle change from dark to dim. It was time for her second sleep, the final slumber of the night. She settled back into her bed, pulling the covers around her, ready to drift off once more. But her sleep now was different. It was deeper, more restorative, and carried a sense of peace born from the quiet acceptance of the natural rhythms of the day. For them, sleep wasn't a continuous process, but a series of episodes separated by periods of wakefulness. After a few hours of sleep, the woman would wake up. She wouldn't be alone in her waking. In a society where communal sleeping was the norm, this awakening would likely be shared. A husband might rise to attend to his animals, a mother to check on her nursing child, or a servant to tend to the needs of her master. But these tasks weren't done in silence. Often they were accompanied by a low murmur of conversation. The night wasn't filled with hushed tones, nor was it considered inappropriate for people to converse during this period. In fact, medieval nights were often filled with music and merriment, especially in the taverns. While the streets would be deserted and shuttered homes would offer sanctuary against the elements and potential dangers, patrons would enjoy a drink and revelry. The tavern was not just a place for nightly debauchery. It was also a hub for important transactions, political discussions, and social networking. Peasants who spent their days working the fields would swap news and gossip, bards would sing tales of adventure and lore, and merchants would discuss trade routes and deals. This wasn't a unique experience. In fact, it was a common occurrence for people in the Middle Ages. The woman we've been following is preparing for her first sleep, the initial phase of a nocturnal routine that most of us would recognize as bedtime. As the sun set, she would have finished her evening chores, perhaps spun some yarn, and now she's settling down for the night. She might read a book or pray, or maybe simply lie in the darkness waiting for sleep to take hold. We can picture her family gathered around a hearth, sharing stories and laughter, their voices gradually fading as tiredness begins to creep in. One by one, they drift off to sleep, lulled by the dancing flames and the comfortable silence that follows. But while we associate this time with winding down and entering a deep slumber, for the medieval folk, this was merely the beginning of their night. As the night wore on, these lively gatherings would slowly wind down. As the minutes ticked by, the sky began to lighten in the east, heralding the approach of dawn. In the morning, when the sun finally peeked over the horizon, she would awaken one last time. For those living in the Middle Ages, this Biphasic sleep pattern was not a choice, but an instinct, a biological imperative. Historians believe this pattern may have been a holdover from our prehistoric past, a time when humans slept in short bursts punctuated by moments of quiet wakefulness. In the tapestry of daily life in the Middle Ages, this nocturnal routine wove a unique thread. In the end, the story of this medieval woman and her nocturnal experiences is really our story too. Now let us go beyond the realm of sleep and take a deep dive into the intriguing customs of the medieval world. You know, if there's one thing that unites us all in our modern world, it's our confusion over sleep. Regardless of how much or how little we get, it seems like all of us are always struggling to fall asleep faster, stay asleep longer, or just feel well rested when we wake up. In fact, there was even a period of time in the night where people wouldn't even be sleeping at all. The first thing to note here is that most people didn't have access to electricity until well into the 20th century. Even after that, many people didn't use lights in their bedrooms, so everyone went to bed sometime shortly after sundown. The exact time people would go to bed varied depending on the season, their age, and whether or not they were a night owl. We have to tread carefully here because we do want to give the impression that sex is the main reason to wake up in the middle of the night. This allowed couples to be intimate without fully waking the woman up, meaning she could keep her clothing on while the man pleasured himself. Of course, this practice didn't last forever. Then they would wake up, maybe have some sex, read a book, check on their farm animals, and go back to sleep until sunrise. You see, our current system of sleeping only once per night is actually relatively new in human history. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the average person slept twice per night. If our ancestors were accustomed to waking up at this time and engaging in non-sleep activities, it's possible that our brains have retained that same pattern and are simply waiting for us to get out of bed and do something. You could be experiencing a natural dip in your brain activity. You could be more comfortable getting out of bed and tending to an activity, or you could be having sex. I'm your host, and I want to thank you so much for joining me. As always, this has been a weird and wonderful journey through the bizarre happenings of our strange planet. But before you go, I have a request. Please consider supporting us because your support helps keep us afloat. Anyway, I hope you learned something new today, and I hope you have a good one. Just remember that whatever it is, it's totally normal. Similarly, it may be that people who claim to be chronic insomniacs are unactually suffering from insomnia at all, but are instead experiencing the natural dip in brain, activity that occurs around 2 or 3 a.m. and getting caught up in their own minds about it. And although there's been a push towards viewing this as an unnatural phenomenon, recent evidence suggests that our bodies may be more suited for this type of segmented sleep than previously thought. Today, this sounds bizarre, but back then this was the norm. What's more, When researchers monitored the sleep patterns of villagers in Tanzania who lived a traditional hunter-gatherer lifestyle, they found that their sleep patterns consisted of two distinct periods separated by a gap of roughly 2 hours. Scientists believe that our bodies naturally crave this extra break, because it gives the nervous system a chance to wind down from the previous period of sleep and reset for the rest of the night. Not everyone in history had sex in the middle of the night, nor does it mean that everyone today should start doing that either. Rather, it shows that breaking up our sleep for a couple of hours in the middle of the night could be a natural and healthy thing to do. For some of us, this might look like getting out of bed to take care of an urgent task like using the bathroom, watering the plants, or petting a pet. For others, it might mean engaging in a relaxing activity like reading or meditation. And for those whose partner is willing, it could include some sexy time. Everyone from peasants to popes to the wealthy elite followed this pattern of segmented sleep. Monks kept detailed records of it. Chaucer wrote about it in his Canterbury Tales, and Shakespeare even mentioned it in Hamlet. As societies became more sexually liberated and people became more comfortable with having sex during the day, the need for discreet middle-of-the-night activity disappeared. But it did happen frequently, and it did happen during this time period. Unlike the first sleep, there isn't much documentation about how long people slept during this period. However, since sunrise was sometime between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., it's estimated that people woke up somewhere between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. and slept until then, so the second sleep could range anywhere from 2 to 8 hours. Doctors who supported the practice argued that having sex in the middle of the night was ideal because the body was still warm from sleep and therefore easier to arouse. Medieval physicians also believed that releasing sexual energy in the middle of the night helped release built-up tension and reduce pain throughout the body. Additionally, as we mentioned earlier, the calm mental state that comes from being sleepy made it easier for couples to resolve conflicts, and therefore less likely for them to fight during these intimate moments. Some people might go to bed early while others might pull a late night. But at the end of the day, everyone was winding down by the time the sun had set. So let's talk about what that was like, what historians and scientists think about it, and why it could help us with our sleep problems today. But it turns out that even getting into bed at night can be a source of stress for us. We want to make sure our room is pitch black. This was a period of slumber that generally lasted between 3 and 5 hours. Sometimes they would lie in bed talking with their spouse or reading a book. Other times, they would leave the bedroom and tend to chores like feeding animals or making sure the fires were ready for the morning. These weren't exactly quiet or restful activities, but they also weren't stressful. People were awake intentionally. So it started around 9 p.m., 10 p.m., and ended around 2 a.m., 3 a.m. After this, people would wake up and engage in what we might jokingly call the weirdo middle part of the night. This is where things get interesting. Our mattress is cool and comfortable. And unless we have a tiny child or a snoring partner, we usually expect to sleep right through the night without interruption. But before electricity and alarm clocks took hold, the way that people went about sleeping was a lot different than it is today. To start, let's look at some examples from history so we can see what normal nighttime behavior used to be like. Once in bed, people would settle into what we today call first sleep. After waking up from first sleep, people would spend anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours fully awake. The other thing that happened during this period of time was sex. Lots of it. Interestingly, there was also an opportunity for more intimate activities because women were expected to sleep with a linen or leather covering over their bodies. In any case, eventually the sun would begin to rise again, and it was time for the second part of the night. Second sleep. So, to recap, our hypothetical person from the past would go to bed at 9 p.m. and sleep until midnight or later. But what's really fascinating about this period of segmented sleep is that it's potentially re-emerging as a modern solution to ancient problems. For example, in 2018, a study found that despite following a strict 24-hour sleep schedule, participants still experienced a dip in brain activity around 3:30 a.m. every morning. This might explain why so many of us have trouble sleeping at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. Now, it's important to note that just because our ancestors engaged in a bimodal sleep pattern doesn't mean that we should too. So the next time you find yourself lying in bed wide awake at 2 a.m., try not to worry. And on that ends yet another edition of Waking Up in the Middle of the Night. Well, more precisely, what medieval people used instead of beds. I will say right away that there were no water beds, no memory foam, no linen sheets, no thread count, and no pajamas. This is a sack filled with straw that you lay on the floor. This is a vast improvement because it keeps bugs out and makes it easier to roll over without disturbing your partner. Straw is not exactly known for being soft, but then again, neither is the linen that wealthier folks enjoyed. Remember, the average person was not afforded the opportunity to own linen, much less sleep naked. If you were born into nobility, you would sleep in a four-poster bed with curtains to block off your area from the rest of the room. This allowed you to have your own climate control, keep it cool during the summer and warm during the winter. It's true that people sometimes wore tunics to bed, but those were everyday garments. We think of pajamas as something flimsy, easy to slip on and off, but the equivalent garment in the Middle Ages was called a kirtle, and it was an underdress. Also, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more content. Thanks for watching. It was like a nightgown that went down to the feet and had long sleeves. So yes, people wore something similar to pajamas, but they were not simple to put on or take off. The wealthy may have slept in their finest robes, but for most people, a kirt was as close as they got to sleepwear. These curtains would be made of fine linen, and they would become a treasured heirloom, passing from generation to generation. In fact, there were only two standard sizes, 6 feet by 3 feet and 4 feet by 2 feet. The first size was meant for adults, either one single adult or a married couple. The second size was made for children, either an unmarried child or a pair of young siblings. Larger beds did exist for royalty, and they could be quite large. The canopy alone could be over 6 feet wide and 12 feet long. That's bigger than the average bedroom. Even if your family lost its noble status, the bed would remain valuable, because everyone else still sleeps on the floor. Sleepwear was not something that the peasant class had any experience with. Well, coincidentally, he also pulled a pillow out of the stone. How did he do it? Did he know something that we don't? There's no record of anyone pulling a pillow out of a stone. But the question is, did they even have pillows? Some of the elite class did, and theirs were often filled with feathers, wool, or down. But for everyone else, it was back to the straw. They either filled their sacks with more straw, or they used a flat piece of wood as a pillowcase. They may have even taken the straw out of their bed and used that. However, it was common for the lower classes to wear their best set of clothes to bed, because that meant that they were less likely to soil them. So if you weren't going to sleep naked, then what were you wearing? Well, that depends on the gender. Men would typically wear a tunic or a shirt, while women would wear a long nightgown. Children wore no special clothing to bed, but were instead swaddled like babies. However, it was not unusual for multiple generations to share a single bed. So if you were a child, you were likely to sleep with your parents, maybe grandparents, and definitely siblings. Linen was considered softer and more sanitary than straw, but it was difficult to weave and expensive to buy. Sheets were usually kept on for up to a week at a time and washed only occasionally, which probably contributed to rampant leprosy. On the other hand, straw needed changing more frequently because, well, you get mites and lice. But having clean bedding wasn't as complicated as we see in modern times. All you had to do was take the soiled sheets, toss them in a corner, and start fresh. The old ones would eventually be used again, but only after being aired out, beaten, and possibly washed. In fact, beating your sheets was an important part of the weekly routine. You wanted to get rid of all the little critters living in there, and beating them against a wall or post was the best way to accomplish that. You didn't want to damage the sheets, though, so you would only do this before washing them. If you did wash them, you probably did it in a full body bath with cold water and whatever soap you had on hand. When they were dry, you would smooth them out, shake them, beat them, fold them carefully, and put them back on your bed. This was usually large enough for 2 people, but larger beds did exist for kings and queens. Many of the peasants might have been happy to have such a bed, but there was another downside to these pallets. They were heavy, moving them around took several strong men, so unless you were willing to hire help, you had to stay in one room in your home for years at a time. The word pallet comes from the Latin pallata, which means palm branch. That doesn't seem very cozy, does it? Well, think of the cheap motel beds that we have today. Those are also made of hard, flat surfaces and a box spring. The difference between a pallet and a modern bed is that the materials are the same. You're still laying on a sack, albeit one that won't move or burst. This was an upgrade, but there were problems. These sacks were often damp and soaked with urine. Sometimes they smelled so badly that the occupants had to leave them outside until they aired out. And air them out. You had to watch out for creepy crawlies. The occasional field mouse is a given, but don't ask. As a bonus, when you went to bed, you could throw off the covers and make a pillow out of the blankets by tucking them inside the sack. And you never had to worry about the cat curling up in your pillowcase. Now, some of those things are self-explanatory, but I will come back to pajamas later. For now, though, let's deal with the first one, waterbeds. For most of human history, running water was not a thing. So a waterbed would be a luxury item, if you know what I mean. But how did they get around that? What did they use instead of a mattress? It depends on whether or not they were lucky enough to have a sack. The majority of people sleeping through the Middle Ages did not have a mattress, even a straw mattress. They just slept on the floor. I know that it sounds uncomfortable, but if you lived in a cold climate, you would understand why people would do that. Your body generates heat, so if you have nowhere else to go, then keeping warm is not that hard. A roof over your head is harder to come by, and that stops drafts and falling stuff from the ceiling. Protection from the elements is a bigger problem than a lack of soft material. People who live in cold climates still sleep on the ground, so it must not be that bad. The upper classes, along with some tradesmen and merchants who were making good money, could afford something called a pallet. If you were well off, you could afford a wooden frame for your pallet. One last thing, before you pull the covers over your head, you should probably ask yourself, will it itch? But here's a question. Who's sleeping in this bed? Sleeping with others is not the only reason that the wealthy would want to separate their beds from the rest of the family. Now, let's talk about pillows. Remember the scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail where King Arthur pulls his sword out of the stone? Now, let's get back to pajamas. Were they worn? The answer is not really. And finally, how big were the beds? The size of a bed depended on your social status. So what do you think? Would you rather sleep on a waterbed or a straw pallet? Please let us know in the comments below. Now, if you're watching this channel regularly, you might have noticed that most of the surviving clothing from the Middle Ages consists of outer garments, tunics, gowns, doublets, hoods, and the like. There are a couple reasons for this. One is that outer garments are generally more durable than undergarments and therefore more likely to survive. But another reason is that they're simply more interesting. After all, there's not much variation on the basic design of a shift or a pair of drawers, and nightcap is the final alcoholic beverage that you have during a night out on the town, a drink that helps you relax and take the edge off after a long day. Nightcaps kept your head warm. Keep in mind that medieval houses weren't like modern houses. Dogs provided heat, companionship, and security. In fact, medieval people kept dogs for many of the same reasons that we keep dogs. Today, though, back then, dogs slept in the bed with the family, which may sound disgusting to us, but to medieval people, it was perfectly normal. This was especially true if you were a woman. Even if you were wearing a fancy gown, if you happened to open the door with a nightcap on, it politely told guests that you were undressed to receive them and that they should come back another time. Given that nightshirts saw a lot of use, a lot of them have survived. Many of these surviving examples are made of linen and date from the 17th century. A good deal of them come from the same source, the former royal palace in Brussels. Some of these nightshirts still have their original owner's name stenciled on them. Many of these names are of noble birth, but there are also nightshirts with the names of 4 yeomen, a footman, a cook, a groom, and a dairymaid. It was considered rude to walk around your house without a nightcap on if you were a woman, but men could do it. Just a few generations ago, most people were wearing nothing at all except maybe a pair of long underwear. And who knows how far back that practice goes? Perhaps someday we'll be able to find out through the magic of archaeology. For now, all we know for certain is what the historical record has told us, that ancient Romans slept nude, medieval Europeans wore nightcaps and nightshirts, and Victorian gentlemen wore full suits to bed. Men's nightcaps tended to be more modest than women's nightcaps because men were expected to go to bed fully clothed. If you'd like to learn more about medieval clothing, check out my book, A Very Short Introduction to Medieval Clothing, available in hard copy and ebook formats. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next week. Bye. When men received guests in their bedrooms, they would drape their robes over their nightcaps to show that they were wearing them. Keeping a dog in bed with you sounds pretty neat if you ask me. In most depictions, they appear to be long, shapeless, itchy, kind of like a big rectangular piece of cloth with holes cut out for the arms. Medieval nightshirts were loose-fitting, but some were tailored to fit better. Like nightcaps, they were made of a variety of fabrics. Linen nightshirts were more common among the wealthy, while the poor were more likely to wear wool. Underneath their nightshirt, a man might wear a simple pair of breeches or drawers. Basically, think of them as medieval boxer briefs. Sure, it gets cold at night, but that dog generates enough body heat to warm up your bed. Also, if a burglar happens to climb in your window in the middle of the night, you probably don't want to wake up to that. But if you happen to wake up to the sound of a dog barking, you know exactly what to blame and you can take appropriate action to defend yourself. Win-win. They were usually made of stone or sometimes thatch and very drafty. This is probably to keep the cap secure and prevent it from falling off in your sleep. A toggle is basically a large button. And in the case of the nightcap, it would have been made of wood or bone. In some cases, the toggles were ornately carved. And again, they tell us something about the wealth of the person wearing the nightcap. So even in the middle of summer, it would often get cold at night inside a house. The nightcaps that were worn in warmer months were usually made of linen, while the winter nightcaps were made of wool. Often they would be padded with scraps of other materials such as flax. Sometimes people would wear two caps, a smaller one inside a larger one, to increase the warmth factor. The outer cap, which was larger, was called the nightgown. But in medieval Europe, a nightcap was actually a hat. It was a small, close-fitting cap that was worn at night. These were generally made of wool or linen. Sometimes they were made of leftover scraps of fabric, and sometimes they were embroidered and very fancy. You can tell a lot about the wearer's status and wealth based on what kind of nightcap they wore. But there's a lot of variety when it comes to, say, the different kinds of surcoats that people wore over their shifts. In contrast to these outer garments, which are relatively well represented in museum collections, there's very little surviving medieval undergarments. What has survived tends to be higher quality stuff like the silk and linen shifts worn by the wealthy elite. Today, we're going to look at some of those undergarments, including both men's and women's nightwear. And before we get into it, I just want to say a huge thank you to our supporters who make videos like this possible. If you'd like to help support the channel and get access to behind-the-scenes photos and videos, please see the links below. Now, let's talk about nightcaps. Okay, so today a nightcap is a drink. Why did medieval people wear these at night? Well, for the same reason that we like to wear cozy socks or fuzzy slippers or flannel pajamas. Medieval people didn't have central heating, but they did have dogs. Many nightcaps had a toggle or a string that went under the chin. It was common to wear your nightcap when you went to bed, but it was also common to wear them when you received guests. Okay, now let's talk about nightshirts. Nightshirts are basically medieval pajamas. Nightshirts were often darned and repaired multiple times. Sometimes they were passed down to servants after the family they worked for was done with them. The clothes that we wear to bed on a daily basis have changed a lot over the course of history. If you like this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. Let's say you're a traveling merchant hawking your wares from town to town, or perhaps a devout pilgrim on a long and arduous journey to a distant shrine. As dusk begins to settle, casting long shadows across the muddy, rutted road, your primary concern is finding shelter. The innkeeper would simply point you toward a large chamber, thick with the smell of stale ale, sweat, and wood smoke. Here you would find what you paid for, a spot in an already occupied bed. To prevent your hard-earned coins from disappearing in the night, you would take careful precautions. They would command their own private chambers, often on an upper floor away from the ruckus of the common room. The alternative was sleeping outside, exposed to the elements. Out there, you faced the chilling rain, the biting wind, the very real danger of wolves or other predators emerging from the woods, and the human threats of bandits, highwaymen, or even the chaos of a local rebellion. In that context, the noisy, crowded, and somewhat smelly inn was not just a bed. It was a sanctuary. These rooms might even feature a sturdy lock, a roaring fire, and a bed to themselves, the height of medieval luxury. Travelers often tied their purses securely to their wrists or belts, making it impossible for someone to snatch them without a struggle. Others would use their most valuable possession, their luggage, or pack as a makeshift pillow. Hoping the discomfort would be a small price to pay for security, you slept with one eye open, trusting no one. Inns of this era were essentially human bunkhouses, operating on the principle of maximum capacity. If a sprawling straw or flock-filled mattress had even a foot of available space, you were expected to take it. You would be sharing your rest with complete strangers, their snores, their grumbling, their coughs, and potentially their boils, lice, and fleas. You spot the welcoming, if slightly grimy, sign of an inn, a bastion of light and warmth against the encroaching wilderness. It was a chaotic system of first come, first sprawled. You might find yourself squeezed between a burly blacksmith on one side and a lice-ridden friar on the other. This forced intimacy with strangers from every walk of life made for a noisy, restless, and often unsanitary night. The only thing separating you from the press of unknown bodies was the thin tunic you slept in. You enter, pay the innkeeper a modest fee, and ask for a bed. But what you get is not the private, clean room we imagine today. The concept of assigning beds based on profession or social standing was a rarity. In such an environment, security was a constant worry. The darkness was a thief's best friend. This chaotic, communal experience, however, was strictly for the common folk. Nobles and the very wealthy had an entirely different reality. But for the average person, the shared lumpy mattress on the floor was a huge and welcome upgrade. You wash your face, maybe brush your teeth, change into some comfy PJs and climb into bed. Then you turn off the lights, pull up the covers and pick up your phone to scroll through TikTok until your eyes get droopy and it's easy to go to sleep. But what if I told you that only 800 years ago, your bedtime would have looked vastly different? You barricade your door with a heavy piece of furniture in case there's an intruder. And you burn some incense to keep the demons away. Then you make the sign of the cross over your bed and tuck in tightly. Most religions of the time believed in a hierarchy of saints, angels, and demons, each vying for your soul. Even though the concept of original sin had been around for centuries, it was in the 12th century that the idea started to take off. Thanks in part to the writings of St. Augustine, people began to believe that humans were born innately sinful, that we're all descended from Adam and Eve, and that we inherit their sin nature. Some theologians even believed that children were born with actual demons inside them, and these demons would follow them around for the rest of their lives, whispering temptations in their ear. Sometimes a witch would cast a spell on your cat, turning it into a demon and using it to harm you in your sleep. To prevent this, you'd need to perform an exorcism on your cat first, before letting it in your bed. Royalty was constantly worried about assassination. It was common for kings and queens to have specially designed beds made out of metal, stone, or concrete. These materials were difficult to set on fire and hard to break into. If you were 800 years ago, you never knew when you'd die. So when you climbed into bed, you did your best to prepare for whatever came next. Plus, they usually had secret passageways for the monarch's guards to sneak around and surprise any intruders. You never saw the demon attacking you, but you hoped your prayer was strong enough to keep him out. Today, we rely on technology to protect us from viruses. And while the threats may seem less tangible, they're no less real. That's why many people still practice a sort of digital penance, deleting cookies, clearing history, and closing unused programs. We may not say a prayer to God, but we do say one to our computers. We hope it works even if we don't understand how. Usually this involves sprinkling holy water on the animal and making the sign of the cross over it. She wrote, When I am in my bed, I cannot sleep for more than 2 hours without my guards waking me, believing that I am being murdered. Given the amount of time people spent in bed, it makes sense that they tried to make it as comfortable as possible. That meant having nice bedding, soft pillows, and a cozy mattress. Just to be safe, you'd probably want to do this in front of a mirror, though, because witches also like to use mirrors to cast spells. That's why it was common to cover your mirrors with a cloth at night. Not only did this prevent witches from using them, but it also prevented the souls of the dead from climbing out of them and possessing you. To escape this cosmic tug-of-war, you needed to call upon every advantage you had. Since people were dying left and right, they had nowhere to go. Sometimes they roamed the earth for decades, haunting the place where they died or the place where they used to live. So if you were staying in an old building, you could end up sleeping in the same bed as a ghost. Again, you'd want to protect yourself with holy water and prayers. Once a year, you go to church and tell the priest all the bad things you done since your last confession. So you say a prayer to make sure you won't murder anyone in your sleep. Maybe you've been eyeing your neighbor's wife. Well, then you better say a prayer to make sure you do unlust after her while you asleep. In medieval times, committing a sin wasn't always intentional. Sometimes it just happened to you. Say a drunk stumbled into your bed and suddenly you're committing fornication. Or maybe a demon jumped into your body and forced you to blaspheme. No matter the cause, the result was still sin. And that's why people said prayers, confessed their sins, and burned incense before bed. They were trying to cleanse themselves so they wouldn't wind up burning in hell. Then he'd give you an absolution, basically forgiving you for your sins. But what if you couldn't wait until next year's confession? Well, then you'd better recite the act of contrition, a prayer asking God for forgiveness. This one was especially popular at bedtime since it gave you a chance to ask forgiveness for any sins you committed that day, plus any you might commit in your sleep. And for children, that meant making sure no goat ate their face. So while your parents were saying a prayer to God, you were saying one to ward off a goat. Because whether you're 3, 30, or 83, you never know when you're gonna die. So you might as well get comfortable. Back then, the average person had so little control over their daily life that going to bed was more than a mere routine. It was a sort of spiritual exercise. The year is 1247. You are 30 years old. You weren't constantly in danger of death. And many people did live to be 60, 70, or even older. But compared to today, life was more chaotic. You could be killed by illness, fire, or thieves in your sleep. So before bed, you take precautions against all three. You probably won't live past 35. There are demons under your bed looking to drag you down into hell. If you don't prepare yourself spiritually, you might just find yourself in the lake of fire when you die. So you do your best to get ready. Now, this isn't a black and white situation. If you lived during the Middle Ages, you would have had at least some control over your life. You place a bucket of water next to your bed in case there's a fire. Children were often put to bed early, and not just because they were noisy. Back then, people slept in four-poster beds with curtains. And while they were great at keeping demons out, they weren't so good at keeping goats out. Goats, which were often kept as pets, were known to sneak into people's beds, particularly the beds of children. This wasn't a huge problem during the day since most people were outside working or doing other things. But at night, well, goats can be pretty frisky. They'd head, but kick you, eat your face, or maybe just lay on top of you. And if you were a small child, there was a good chance you wouldn't survive the night. So, to protect themselves, kids would say a prayer before bed, sometimes one specifically against goats. It wasn't necessarily a prayer to God, though. But it wasn't just children who needed protection. If you were an adult, you had to watch out for demons trying to tempt you into sin. So, if you wanted to get to heaven, you had to do everything you could to keep those demons out of your head. Confession was a big part of this. You may not have intended to harm another person, but the thought crossed your mind. They weren't the only ones either. Your pets got the same treatment. Of course, you'd also need to watch out for ghosts. And depending on who you were, you might need to protect yourself from more than just demons and ghosts. But not everyone was so lucky. Queen Isabella of France, for example, had a wooden bed, and she was regularly haunted by nightmares. But even so, going to bed was still a scary proposition. In a way, saying prayers and casting out demons was kind of like installing antivirus software. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Medieval people took their dreams seriously. They believed that they were divine messages from God, the Virgin Mary, Jesus himself, your grandma after she died, or even Satan. The folks of the Middle Ages weren't like us modern types, who dismiss our dreams as just a byproduct of too much cheese or worrying about taxes. He believed that dreams could bring about demonic possession and suggested that a person who has experienced a demonic dream should seek out an exorcist. He also recommended certain precautions, such as blessing the bed with holy water and making the sign of the cross over the sick person before sleep. Take, for example, Catherine of Siena, who had a vision of Jesus in the 14th century. She described seeing him along with Mary, John the Baptist, and many saints. Medieval people also reported dreaming about animals with human heads. This was because dreams were seen as a way to communicate with God or the supernatural, and people wanted to make sure they were interpreting them correctly. After all, you don't want to miss an important message from the divine because you thought a fish was just a fish, right? Now, you might think that that's a little freaky, but it wasn't unheard of. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button to stay up to date on all our wacky medieval misadventures. Also, if you enjoyed this video, check out our other content where we explore even more bizarre aspects of history. From the bubonic plague to the Spanish Inquisition, we've got you covered. So click away and happy dreaming. Just beware of goat-headed men with fishy habits. In fact, there was even a famous relic in Paris that was said to have been a goat-headed man that people would kiss for good luck. And you heard me right, kiss. This creature was so popular that people would line up for hours just to get a chance to smooch that goat head. But kissing relics wasn't the only way people interacted with the supernatural in their dreams. Sometimes they'd receive cryptic messages from spirits or have visions of the future. For example, the Black Death, which was a horrible plague that killed millions of people in Europe in the 14th century, was predicted in a dream long before it happened. One man named John of Burgundy had a dream in which he saw a black cloud filled with horrible spirits floating over London. He took this dream to the king and told him to cancel all public events and close the gates to the city. But the king didn't listen and basically told John to buzz off. And guess what happened? The Black Death came to London and killed a bunch of people. So maybe John's dream was actually a premonition instead of a message from Satan, who knows? This vision gave her a newfound sense of purpose and led her to start writing down her visions and mystical experiences. And that's not the only time someone saw Jesus hanging around some fish. Back in 1162, a church in Germany was trying to figure out whether or not its new bishop was actually the Antichrist. You heard me right? They thought their bishop was the Antichrist? Now, to be fair, this guy was a bit of a problem. He had this weird habit of disappearing during Mass, leaving everyone to wonder where he went and what he was doing. One day, the townspeople finally caught up with him and discovered he was fishing. They confronted him about his mysterious absences, and he just shrugged it off as a hobby. But this left the townspeople even more confused and suspicious. And rumors started spreading that the bishop had seen visions of Christ during his fishing trips. Things got so bad that Pope Eugene III had to step in and put an end to the whole Antichrist speculation. And get this, he suggested putting a crucifix under the person's pillow. Well, hold on to your horses, because it gets weird. See, people in the Middle Ages believed that dreams were a way for God to communicate with humans, and they took those communications pretty seriously. Dreams were considered to be messages from God, the Virgin Mary, Jesus, your grandma after she died, or even Satan. People kept dream journals and would go to great lengths to interpret their dreams and figure out what they meant. Sometimes these dream interpreters would use complicated methods to decipher the hidden meanings of symbols and figures that appeared in dreams. Other times they'd rely on common signs and superstitions, like the belief that seeing two moons meant someone was gonna die soon. And let's not forget about the classic belief that if you saw the devil in your dreams, you were destined for sainthood. Yeah, that's right. Satan, the epitome of evil, was a sign that you were chosen by God. Talk about irony. But here's the thing. This practice of putting crosses under pillows to ward off demons was already a widespread custom by this point. It's mentioned in a letter written by the English Bishop Edmund Custos in 1298, in a poem by the French troubadour Pierre Cardinal in the 12th century, and even in a homily given by preacher and mystic Salambin Diadem in the early 14th century. So, by the time Nadir came along, the custom of putting crucifixes under pillows was already a thing. But what exactly did it mean for a dream to be demonic? Well, that depended on who you asked. Oh no, they had a whole system for recording, interpreting, and responding to dreams. Her book contained the dreams that she had recorded throughout her life and included her own interpretations. In one dream, she saw her brother being taken away in chains. She interpreted this dream as an omen of his death. Then there was the time she dreamed that she herself was being taken away in chains, which she interpreted as a warning of her impending corruption by Satan. Yep, corruption by Satan. We've all been there. According to Gundred, Satan often appeared in women's clothing in people's dreams to trick them. Now this might sound a little crazy, but she's not the only one who thought this way. St. Bridget of Sweden also reported seeing a woman in her dreams who turned out to be Satan. So you can see how people back then were pretty open to the idea that demons could disguise themselves as hot chicks. And if you had one weird dream, well, then it was time for an exorcism. First off, medieval people kept dream journals. Now sure, we all keep dream journals too, but only because we have nothing better to do in our free time. For medieval people, it was a matter of life and death, not to mention salvation or damnation. It was super important to remember your dreams, because they could tell you all kinds of stuff about yourself and the world around you. Like, you know how we think that déjà vu is when we're having a premonition? Well, the French monk Audin of St. Victor thought that déjà vu was actually a warning of imminent death. That's why he included questions about this strange sensation in his 12th century manual for dream interpretation. In medieval France, seeing 2 moons in your dreams meant that someone was going to die soon, the second moon representing the soul of the deceased. Seeing the devil in a dream, well, that might mean you were destined to become the next pope. Okay, it wasn't quite that cut and dry, but the idea was that each symbol required careful consideration. A single rosebud could hint at either virginity or the Virgin Mary. See, these symbols had secret meanings. Like roses symbolized perfection and chastity, while a pomegranate represented lust and sensuality. By deciphering the secret meanings of these symbols, you could understand the true message behind your dream. These symbols could also come from everyday objects like a crown jewel or a simple kitchen knife. And this practice of giving everyday items special meaning continued through the Renaissance and into the Romantic era. When the poet John Keats wrote about a Grecian urn, he used this method to give it a deeper meaning. So basically, anyone could be an expert in dream interpretation, just look at everything and take it metaphorically. Sure, that sounds pretty easy, but sometimes things got really weird. In 1375, a German man named Johann Schneider wrote a book called The Exorcismus, which was basically a how-to guide for performing exorcisms. Now let me introduce you to our girl Gundred of Artha, a nun who wrote a dream book back in the 12th century. But it wasn't just random women or seductive seductresses who showed up in people's dreams. Sometimes you could catch a glimpse of the divine. Now, what does all this talk of seeing Jesus during fishing trips have to do with dreams, you ask? But it wasn't just religious figures who made appearances in people's dreams. What's crazy, though, is that even after people learned how to read and write, they still relied heavily on dream interpreters and fortune tellers to tell them what their dreams meant. So what's the craziest dream you've ever had? Let us know in the comments below. They needed the cows for plowing fields. They needed the cows for milk. They needed the cows for meat. And so they would keep them close by. Not only were they eating some of the cows, but they were also taking care of them. Why is that? Well, cows are like big furry blankets. So, in this corner, they had a fireplace. Right here, next to the fireplace, is where they did most of their cooking. There's still some pots and pans hanging here. The children, of course, slept in the loft above the cows. The cows would sometimes push their way in, but nothing too crazy. Well, it might surprise you to know that it probably wasn't that bad. But in this culture, they actually took pride in their hygiene. They would cover their mouths when they burped. They wouldn't blow their noses in the bed. That was always pretty smelly. They would go outside to do that. And then, after the cows would give birth, they would actually take the newborn calf outside of the village to cleanse itself. So, in this type of environment, it probably wasn't too bad. It was an entire occupation. Some of the servants would make more money picking lice than they would doing other tasks. Animals don't necessarily stink unless they haven't bathed in a while. And in this case, the pigs probably needed a bath more than the cows. And let's face it, there's still a problem today. People spend thousands of dollars trying to get rid of bedbugs. They would often hide in mattresses. So the mattress was probably the dirtiest part of this house. But the cows would occasionally go outside and graze, and then they would bring hay back into the house. Flies would buzz around the house. They would often land on the food. And so people would develop ways to stop flies from coming in. For example, they would stuff garlic in the beds. Other times they would hang garlic from the rafters. But honestly, I don't think it helped that much. But it did smell nice. Where are the spiders? Well, they were everywhere. Spiders were a nuisance. And this family had some unique traditions to help them get to sleep. It's a little bit dilapidated now, but it's a good opportunity for us to talk about chickens. Chickens were usually free range. They would roam around the village looking for food, pecking at things, and they would return to the co-op at night. Of course, predators would try to attack the chickens, so people would need to protect them. And this meant building strong chicken coops. They would often build them up off the ground, and they would use wood to ward off potential predators, like wolves. For example, they would save their urine and then they would use it to wash their faces. It sounds nasty, but they believed it helped prevent acne. Secondly, they would sleep fully clothed. There was no such thing as pajamas back then. And the peasants also slept in their Sunday best, even the children. If you washed your hair, the lice would actually swim faster. So the only way to get rid of them was to actually comb them out. Now, if you were poor like the family who lived in this house, you would have to comb out your own hair. If you were rich, you would have servants to do it for you. And apparently the servants got paid extra to pick the lice out of the master's head. They would build webs in the corners. They would build webs in the beds. And this was long before bug spray. So the only way to get rid of them was to burn certain herbs like lavender and rosemary. They would burn these herbs to try to mask the smell so the spiders wouldn't come in. They would lay down and chew their cud. So they kind of kept themselves clean. When you enter the bedroom, there are 2 beds here. These are both double beds. In fact, this is bigger than my bed. And you'll notice something interesting. One bed has a big gap in the middle. Well, this is because the mother would get in the bed, and then the father would get in the bed, and then they would put the divider in between. This way they could keep each other warm and snuggle. But the interesting thing is, above the fireplace, they kept their pigs. Pigs are dirty animals. And in Bulgaria, they used to raise a pig every year for food. They would eat the pig during Christmas time. So this was the perfect place to keep the pig. It's close to the fire, nice and toasty. And then they could easily take it out and slaughter it whenever they wanted. I mean, look at this size difference between me and this cow. A lot of body heat radiates off of them. If you lived in a big city like London, and those cities were filthy, things are a little bit different in this village. Yes, they did have rats here, but it was more the pigs that brought in the rodents. Humans would have been quite cold without the cows. So they would have actually preferred this situation. In fact, some of the cows were pregnant, so they had to protect the cows from predators. They also had to protect the cows from the elements, cold, wet winters. So keeping them inside was a necessity. There's no other rooms in this house. So everyone slept in here, including 6 children, 2 parents, and 4 cows. This is where the cows and the family sleep. We'll go ahead and walk across the threshold. It's kind of hard to see because it's dark. But right here, in this corner, is the family's bed. Right above it is a loft, and that's where the children would sleep. Above the cows, that doesn't sound very fun. And I mean, just imagine trying to fall asleep while listening to cows mooing and, having their warm breath on you. That's a lot of people and cows to fit in one room. Now, when you think of a traditional home, especially a modern home, You might be thinking, well, why wouldn't they put the cows outside? Well, this was all one big family unit, and that included the cows. They weren't just pets, they were part of the family. But it's pretty exciting because not only does it have a thatched roof, it also has an animal pen attached to it. So these types of houses are called a Hull house. They're found all over Northern Europe. You'll see them in places like Denmark, Sweden, Norway. But we're here today because this one is actually in Bulgaria, and it dates back to 1870, so we're going to step inside. This house was built by Bulgarian peasants. Now, there was really no other option. Their life revolved around the cows. We're now going to move into the cow pen. And this is where the magic happens. Now, the interesting thing is that the cows actually probably slept better than the humans in this house. Now, we're going to go to the far end of the house, and this is actually the entrance into the kitchen area. So what about rats and mice? You know, we've heard stories about these places being infested with rodents. Were they really that bad? Sometimes. Now, we're going to go to the bedroom area, or at least where the parents slept. But what about the cows? Did they ever come in here and interrupt any romantic moments? It did happen on occasion, yes. Now, some of you might be thinking, wow, this must have smelled horrible in here. Like dirty cows, dirty pigs, and humans everywhere. Now, humans aren't exactly known for keeping themselves clean either. The one thing that would definitely stink up the place, though, was the outhouse. They had an outhouse right outside of the main door. Now what about spiders and other creepy crawlies? I can already see cobwebs hanging from the rafters. And speaking of spiders and insects, they also had a problem with lice. And the worst part about it was you couldn't kill them with water. I'm sure you're wondering how many hours a day did these people spend picking lice out of someone's head. Now, the good news was that they didn't have mosquitoes in this region of the world, but they did have bed bugs. There was another insect that would find its way into this house, and that was the fly. Now, even though it might have been difficult to sleep in this house, it was also very cozy. Finally, we're going to go to the chicken coop. This was attached to the side of the house. The modern-day luxury of a private, quiet, and pest-free bedroom was an unimaginable concept for most in the medieval world. Sleep was a far more perilous and communal affair, fraught with spiritual anxieties, physical discomfort, and the ever-present threat of vermin. The night was considered the devil's playground, a time when the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds thinned and malevolent entities roamed freely. It was not merely a matter of practicality or a lack of space, but a crucial form of spiritual and social defense. Families, including children, servants, and even overnight guests, would often share not just a room but a single large bed. More profoundly, the prostrate position was seen as dangerously evocative of death. Monks, ever vigilant in their spiritual discipline, would often sleep leaning against a wall or on specially designed benches with nothing more than a hood for comfort. Personal hygiene was a luxury few could afford, and laundry was an expensive and laborious task. Soap, when available, was often a harsh concoction of animal fats and lye. Beds were sometimes filled with aromatic herbs like lavender, mint, and chamomile in an attempt to repel the invaders. Comfort was a secondary concern to the paramount need for survival. Knights and soldiers would often sleep in partial armor, such as a mail shirt or a breastplate, to ensure they were at least partially protected in the event of a surprise attack. Other, more extreme measures included sleeping in ashes or surrounding the bed with garlic. While these techniques may have done little to deter the vermin, they undoubtedly made the prospect of a shared, cozy snuggle a challenging proposition. For them, true rest was secondary to the pursuit of virtue through discomfort. The goal was to minimize the chances of dreaming, as dreams were considered a potential gateway to sinful thoughts and desires. The clatter of approaching hooves in the dead of night would leave little time for the leisurely process of donning a full suit of armor. Waking from a fitful sleep, perhaps filled with dreams of a peaceful harvest, to the chaotic reality of an enemy raid meant that being even partially armored provided a crucial advantage. The combination of morning breath and the cold, unyielding embrace of chainmail was the grim reality of a warrior's rest. An unchaste dream could necessitate a pre-dawn confession, reinforcing the idea that even in sleep one's soul was on trial. Their nights were a far cry from our modern experience of sleep. They navigated a world of segmented slumber, punctuated by periods of wakefulness for prayer or work, endured the constant irritation of biting insects, and sought solace and safety in the company of others. The simple act of retiring to a private, comfortable, and pest-free bed is a luxury that would have been, for them, the stuff of dreams. In a society where faith was paramount, one did not wish to inadvertently signal one's demise to God or, more perilously, to the angel of death. This fear of being mistaken for a corpse fueled the preference for a more alert sleeping posture. This huddle of humanity created a moral buffer zone, a collective presence that was believed to deter the forces of evil. The logic was simple. If a demon were to strike, there would be witnesses, or at the very least, someone else might get possessed first. For a married couple to sleep with their children was standard practice, and offering a spot in the bed to a traveler was a common courtesy. The search for relief was a constant struggle. The well-to-do employed servants whose duties included the meticulous and often fruitless task of delousing their masters' heads. The ubiquity of these pests is immortalized in the era's literature, with poems written about fleas that ranged from moralizing allegories to surprisingly romantic odes. Conversely, being forced to sleep alone was often a form of punishment, an enforced isolation that carried a heavy weight of social and spiritual shame. Darkness and solitude were not merely an absence of light and company. They were an invitation to spiritual vulnerability. It was a deeply ingrained belief that an isolated sleeper was an easy target for demonic possession, ghostly visitations, or the sinister whispers of temptation. The simple act of retiring for the night was a complex ritual, shaped by a worldview that saw the darkness as a domain of supernatural danger and the waking world as a constant test of virtue. In the medieval mindset, to sleep alone was to court disaster. This pervasive fear fostered a culture of communal sleeping that transcended class and wealth. The now unfamiliar practice of sleeping in a semi-recumbent or almost seated position was a deliberate choice for many during the Middle Ages, particularly among the affluent and the devoutly religious. This was not a misguided understanding of comfort, but a lifestyle rooted in a combination of medical and spiritual beliefs. Physiologically, it was thought that lying flat was detrimental to digestion, a critical concern in an era where the workings of the body were poorly understood. The wealthy commissioned ornate shorter beds with built-in angled headboards, often piled high with bolsters and pillows to support a seated position. Long before ghosts and ghouls populated the nightmares of the popular imagination, the true horrors of the medieval night were far smaller and infinitely more persistent. A relentless onslaught of fleas, lice, and bedbugs. Beds, typically stuffed with straw, hay, or even feathers for the wealthy, were ideal breeding grounds for these unwelcome companions. A host of largely ineffective pest control methods were employed with desperate optimism. While the image of a knight sleeping in a full suit of plate armor is largely a product of romantic fiction, the reality for soldiers during wartime was not far from it. The medieval battlefield was a place of constant peril, and the ability to spring into action at a moment's notice could be the difference between life and death. So, as you settle into your quiet, climate-controlled bedroom, spare a thought for your medieval counterparts.